You see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Good morning. Well, we have a nice turnout today. We have some guests, and we have a wonderful program ahead. Hours worth of work and lifetime expertise, all wrapped up in about an hour. I think Rachel would accept some questions at the end, and we are going to get started, and I will introduce some of our guests at the end when Rachel is finished. I wanted to thank Diane Hammond, though, when we had this idea of having the Presepio months ago, in fact, probably a year ago almost, and she made the contacts with the museum. She's part of the museum, and not as an exhibit, but as a red-blooded, warm-blooded representative of the museum. How's that? We have a pathologist up here. Gary could help us make that definition clearer. But we have a Rachel Delphia, who's going to be speaking as a representative of the museum. And she has had a MA from the University of Delaware at the Winterthur program in Early American Culture. And she holds an MA in English and a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Industrial Design from Carnegie Mellon. That's a very distinguished background, Rachel. I know because I had a sister that was plodding her way through that major years ago. But we hope to be finished by 11:15 or so, and but I think we'll show the program first. And Rachel, I'll turn this over to you initially here.
Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then this is on. Could I trouble you to could I put this microphone and this gavel somewhere just so that I don't accidentally knock them off in the middle of my talk? Thank you so much. All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all of you for having me here today. It's really an honor to join your meeting and to be able to talk about the museum's Neapolitan Presepio, which is really a beloved tradition in Pittsburgh. How many people have been to see the Neapolitan Presepio sometime in the last 62 years? Okay, a number of hands, but we have a number of people who haven't. So I hope that I will perhaps inspire some new visitors today. So let me just see how this guy works. Yes. It doesn't seem to, it's not, oh, wrong way. There we go. Okay. With the technology settled, I think we can start. So in 1956, Carnegie Museum of Art's first curator of decorative arts. So I think at this point there's been 6 or 7 of us. The first curator of decorative arts, my original predecessor, Herbert Weisberger, acquired this object for the museum. This is called a Presepio, which is an Italian word that means crib, or crèche would be another name for the nativity that we might recognize of French extraction instead of Italian. So this came from the family of a man named Eugenio Catello in Naples. And the Catello family had owned this for a long time, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. But after World War II, the family came into some hard times and decided to part with parts of their art collection that they had cherished. And the Carnegie's curator, Mr. Weisberger, as I mentioned, became aware of the fact that this was for sale. So with the help of George and Marjorie Wyckoff, who were Pittsburghers and big museum supporters, they brought this to the museum with the Wyckoff's financial support. So what you're looking at here is a 250 square foot installation. It consists of a half dozen buildings and over 100 figures, humans, angels, and animals, that date from about 1700 to 1830. So these are between 200 and 300 years old. And this has been shown annually at the museum since 1967, which makes it the oldest public display of this art form, this particular version of the nativity scene in this country. And we're very, very proud of that tradition. I've had the privilege of working with this collection since 2006. There we go. So this is where we display the Presepio at the museum. It has not always been so. It has been in some other spaces, but for many, many years, we have shown it right here. So this is in our Grand Hall of Architecture, and we nestle it into this architectural niche. This is a Romanesque French church, and so that might be a little bit incongruous, but in fact, the original owners of these nativity scenes, who were the wealthy members of the royal court in Naples in the 1700s, many of them set them up in architectural niches in their own villas and palazzos. So in that respect, it's accurate. So this morning, I'd like to share a little bit about the history of this object, how it came to us, what this art form is all about. I think that this, in the more than a decade I've been working with it, I realize that some people appreciate this as I have come to, as the rich multimedia work of art that it is, but I think other people think it's just a holiday decoration. It's just the museum's nativity scene, and it's no different than the nativity scene that might be at the base of the USX Tower downtown, or something like that. But it really is a work of art, and so I want to tell you about that today. So these are some detailed shots. You know what? Turn this. Does that turn on? It's okay. I can see. All right. So I want to talk about, start by tracing some of the origins of nativity scenes, and then continue describing the peculiarities of this art form in Naples, and then finally talk a little bit about the future of the collection at the museum. So there's not a lot of information, and not really no visual depictions of how these works were installed in Naples in the 1700s. There are some wonderful written descriptions, and there was a British surgeon by the name of Samuel Sharp who visited Naples in 1760, and he describes, quote, "a species of devotion to be seen in Naples, a group of little figures or puppets representing the whole transaction, wise men, shepherds, angels, and Virgin and Infant and Joseph." And Sharp says, "In short, the composer has introduced such figures and historical facts into the group as the New Testament and sometimes his own genius has suggested, an artful disposition, most wonderfully deceitful to the eye." A certain merchant has one on top of his house where the perspective is so well preserved that by being open at one end, the distant mountains become a continuity of the Presepio and really seem to be part of it. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful account. He points out two really critical things. One, the fact that this tradition, this Italian nativity scene tradition, is not meant to be fully accurate and an exact depiction of the nativity as described in Scripture. There's a lot of artistic license taken with this. They were having fun, and in fact, situating the nativity within their own life in 18th century Naples. The other thing that Sharp is really picking up on is the realism, the intense realism of this work of art. The fact that somebody has installed his Presepio on his villa so perfectly that as it disappears, the vanishing point goes off into the distance. The perspective looks like it's a continuation with the mountains of the actual surrounding landscape. And that's something that actually we could be better at in our presentation, is preserving that kind of wonderful sense of accurate perspective. So, to turn a bit to the history of nativity scenes, students of art history, even casual ones, know that the art historical canon abounds with scenes of Christ's birth. It is due in no small part, I'm sure, to the long-standing associations of the church with wealth and art patronage. There are many, many scenes in 2 dimensions of Christ's birth. 3-dimensional displays are thought to have started with St. Francis in Assisi in the 13th century. And in the town of Greccio in 1223, St. Francis staged a reenactment of the Nativity with live actors, a tradition that we also know continues. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm flashing the laser pointer at the audience. So these 3-dimensional scenes continued, and in the 16th century, Jesuits promoted the creation of 3-dimensional nativity scenes as a devotional activity. So this was something that continued to develop, and by the 1600s, nativity scenes were actually quite common in private homes throughout Rome and Genoa and Sicily and Naples. So in the 18th century, a very specific tradition developed in Naples that embraced the Nativity as an expressive art form and an amusing diversion rather than a purely religious devotion. So that's what I want to talk about, how this one particular tradition developed. So the Neapolitan Presepio blossomed during the reign of a Bourbon king and a Saxon queen, and their grand artistic ambitions in the Baroque and Rococo taste. So in the middle of the 18th century, Naples was the capital of the joint kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, and those were ruled by Spanish Bourbon kings. And you're seeing on the left Carlos, Carlos the Seventh he's Carlos III of Spain and the 7th of Naples. This is the son of Philip V. And on the right, you're seeing his queen. This is Maria Amalia of Saxony, Poland, whom he married in 1738. Now, she's significant because she was the daughter of Augustus the Strong. Does anybody know who Augustus the Strong was? Okay, well, I'm a little bit of a porcelain nerd. Has anyone ever heard of Meissen porcelain? Okay, Augustus was the Elector of Saxony and the King of Poland, and he was so obsessed with Chinese porcelain that he imprisoned an alchemist named Johann Bacher and said, I need you to figure out how to make me porcelain or make me gold so I can buy more porcelain from China. Since we can't actually transmute metals into gold, you can imagine which task Böttger succeeded with. So her grandfather was the founder of the Meissen porcelain factory, which was the first porcelain factory in Europe, established in 1710. And this is actually related, and I'll explain that in a moment. But more about the Naples that they ruled. Naples in the middle of the 1700s was a thriving port city. It had about 400,000 residents, and it was the third largest city in Europe after Paris and London. So this was a cultural capital, a very cosmopolitan place. There were more than 100 princes and hundreds more dukes, marquises, counts in the Neapolitan kingdom. So there was a very strong base for patronage of the arts and for conspicuous consumption. And both of those facts fueled the development of this art form. So the years in which Carlos, here on the left, and their son, Ferdinand, ruled Naples, or called the Golden Age of Naples. So this is nearly a century, from 1734 to 1825. Sorry, still figuring out this pointer. There we go. So there's some Meissen porcelain. So Carlos was very much inspired by the porcelain that his wife's family had created, and it was abundantly supplied to the family through Maria Amalia's connections. But with that inspiration, Carlos founded his own porcelain factory in Naples, Capodimonte, in the early 1740s. So here you're seeing pieces of the Swan service. This is a very famous service of several thousand pieces that was literally being made at Meissen for a man named Count Heinrich von Brühl, the year that Carlos and Maria Amalia were married in 1738. And here is a piece of Capodimonte porcelain. So this is a holy water font created at Capodimonte, the porcelain factory that Carlos founded. And you can see here a really strong affinity in both the style and the subject of the porcelain factory's works and the Presepio. So you have these wonderful little winged putti in this holy water font, and we'll see them again in the Presepio. And in fact, many of the modelers, the sculptors at the factory who worked in porcelain, in their spare time made pieces for Presepi. So I have said that this is a multimedia art form, and it really was. And it took all of the artists and artisans at the court of Naples to contribute to these works. So some of the other artists who were involved were certainly sculptors. So you're seeing on the screen the work of a man named Francesco Celebrano. And these are two marble reliefs, elements of the high altar at the chapel of San Severo. And these were made in the mid-1750s by Celebrano. And then here, in the foreground, is a rustic man by the same artist. So this is also by Celebrano. Here he's working in terracotta instead of in marble. And then here is a work by another important sculptor, the Royal Court in Naples. This is the work of Giuseppe San Martino. This is in that same chapel, the Cappella San Severo, and this is the Veiled Christ. And then here, this is a mendicant and boy, two beggars, again, sculpted in terracotta, but by the same artist who was also working in marble. And you can really appreciate in both the Veiled Christ and in these beggars the dramatic composition of the figures, how emotionally evocative they are as subjects. And so these are just a few of the examples of how these artisans worked both on the fine arts and also on the Presepi. So with the help of all of these creative individuals, Carlos and Maria Amalia amassed a Presepio collection of more than 1,000 figures. This is not theirs. We don't have a depiction of the royal Presepio. They were very involved in it, despite their numerous responsibilities as sovereigns. They themselves took part in the creation of their Presepio. He was known to make sets and carve figures, and Maria Amalia crafted costumes and jewelry using the finest textiles as well as real jewels. Silversmiths at the court made tiny platters for the inns, censers for the angels, and in fact, we have silver elements in the Presepio that bear 18th century silver marks from Naples. Naples was also celebrated in the 18th century for its opera. For the performing arts. And capitalizing again on that talent, members of the court hired these theatrical artists as set directors to help envision the scenes for the Presepio, and also to assist with lighting. And they actually used little oil-burning glass globes to light their scenes. So this is one of the oldest Presepi that exist anywhere in the world, in a museum collection. So this is called the Presepi Cuciniello. That's the name of the family that owned it. And this was given to the Museo di San Martino in 1879. So, again, this is an art form that survived in large part by being passed down from generation to generation in that kind of tradition of this is how you set it up and this is what you do. And so to have this display that's been in a museum since the 1870s is a really important and exciting historical touch point. Okay, so I've been discussing the Presepi as a multimedia art form, talking about the sculptors, the porcelain modelers, and even the silversmiths, but I also want to point out the painters who provided scenic backdrops, but who also provided the visual inspiration. And so I'm going to show you a number of paintings by Neapolitan artists of this period. So on the right, you're looking at The Flight into Egypt by an artist named Luca Giordano. This is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so this artist, Giordano, was also actually summoned to Spain to paint for Philip V. So this is an artist who's patronized in many forms by the Bourbons. And notice the attention to the realistic gestures and facial expressions, and also the color palettes, the rich draping of the clothing. On the left, of course, you can see our Holy Family. And some of the details that I love to point out here, you see these beautiful halos in the painting. Look, we have actual brass rings around their heads to give them halos. Again, the color palette, the way that the fabric drapes, and then these little putti again. We saw them on the holy water font, and here they are in the Presepio. So there's all these wonderful visual relationships and inspiration taken straight from painting of the period. So here we're seeing St. John the Baptist by another Neapolitan painter, Mattia Preti. And here I'd encourage you to look at the musculature of the figures, their seated poses on rugged rocks, and even the fact, you can't quite see the fisherman's hand as well because it's in the netting, but they are both gesturing to the Father in heaven. They're both gesturing with their right hand pointing to the sky. Here we're seeing the Presepio Angels, another painting, the Annunciation, also by Giordano, and then that compared with the Museum of Art's Presepio Angels. So again, you can see the way that Presepio as an art form is trying to incorporate all of the best of lighting and composition and color and subject from the arts of the period. And then one final note on that theme is the genre scene. So on the right, you're seeing Gaspare Traversi's teasing a sleeping girl. And on the left, you're seeing a crying maiden in the Presepio selling fruit, and her eyes and kind of all around her eyes are red from crying. So I hope these all of these juxtapositions help us see how the Presepio fits into the 18th century artistic traditions of Naples. And painting, as evidenced here in Traversi's works, painting in this period in Naples was broadening beyond religious tradition and becoming more secular, increasing the interests of the Neapolitan society, and the Presepio is balancing that as well. Now, in terms of, to go back to our historical narrative a bit, we talked about this golden age of Naples from the 1730s to the 1820s under the rule of the Bourbon kings. In the early 19th century, there was a lot of political turmoil in Italy, ending with the unification of the Italian states. Basically, this disrupts a lot of the smaller courts, so a lot of the original Presepio collections were broken up in the early 1800s. And this is really where the story of the family who owned our Presepio picks up. Our Presepio originated in the 18th century. We don't know who the original family was that owned it, but we do know that the Catello family in the 19th century was part of this second generation of Presepio collectors who seized up these wonderful objects as the original court collections were broken up. So here I'm showing you pictures of the Catello family Presepio as it looked around 1930, when Eugenio Catello, who ultimately sold it to the Carnegie, was a young man. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation too, that it was financial difficulties that the family faced after World War II that forced them to consider parting with some of these pieces. So before they sold it, it was displayed publicly in Rome. This is an exhibition of the Catello Presepio at the Basilica di San Marco in Rome in 1950. And we actually have a black and white glossy photograph of this in the archives. And there are a number of elements. I mean, this here, the Roman ruin, this building, and many individual figures that we can zoom in and identify as being part of the Carnegie's Presepio today. We did not get all of the Catello collection. The Catello collection was quite large, but all of our pieces did come from the Catello collection. So here are some wonderful additional historical documents. I have these binders in our archives. It's a whole series of these little black and white photos with numbers above them. This is the cataloging information from the Catellos, and these are the photographs that the curator used to select which pieces should come to the Carnegie. So they all have these little X's and circles and marks, and if you spend enough time with it, you can figure out that that's what they're doing. They're saying, we'll take this one, but not that one. So the Carnegie acquired, as I said, about 100 human and angelic figures, and then also another several dozen animals, and then hundreds of tiny props, everything from grapes to little pieces of cheese to bottles and all kinds of little vessels, and these are called finimenti, or finishing touches. So these are the little props that give the Presepio its lifelike detail. So this is Marjorie Wyckoff. This is Mrs. George McGee Wyckoff, and she and her husband were very close to the museum. She was one of the founding members of our Women's Committee of the Museum of Art, an incredible organization that still exists and exists as its own nonprofit organization with a mission to support the Museum of Art. So Mrs. Wyckoff was one of the founding members, and she and her husband gave the funds to curator Herbert Weisberger to bring this object to the museum. So they bought it in 1956, and the first year that it was on display was in 1957. And this is from the Pittsburgh Press that year with the inaugural display. So it's very interesting. I mentioned how Samuel Sharp, this British surgeon who went to Naples in the 1760s, talked about the composer, the composition. Somebody is setting up this whole scene. And Eugenio Catello, in Naples, himself a third-generation owner of a Presepio, was our composer. When this came to the museum, he helped the museum staff figure out how to assemble this and present this at our museum. And so this is a sketch. I think either Catello or somebody else in his circle did this. And so this is the basis for how the museum displays the Presepio. So a number of original buildings came from the Catello family. So the wonderful Roman ruin, and then all of these buildings over here, which make up the market scene. There were other pieces, like here in the center, there's a stream, there's a bridge in the front. Those pieces were executed in Pittsburgh by our staff in the 1950s in order to fulfill this design. So this is from 1958. This is the second year that the Presepio was displayed, and you can see it was quite a sensation. It has a wonderful full-color spread in the Pittsburgh Press in 1958, and do note the scenic backdrop. And also this column right here. If you've been to the museum and you think about where there are white columns, the answer is in the Hall of Sculpture, not the Hall of Architecture where we show this now. So early on, this was in the Hall of Sculpture with a fully painted scenic backdrop behind it. At some point in time in the history of the Presepio, we have this scenic backdrop fell apart and we stopped using it. And that is a challenge and something I'd like us to try to bring back because we go back to that original idea of realistic perspective being so important, and we aren't maintaining that when we show it against Saint-Gilles. The back of our scene just turns into this precipice where people could presumably just walk up and drop off a cliff instead of having a backdrop that would have mountains and a road continuing what you see in the foreground. I also love this headline here, Bethlehem in miniature. So I mentioned the increasingly secular society in Naples in the 18th century, and so this is actually kind of a misnomer, because one of the liberties that the Neapolitans are taking with the Presepio is that they're situating it in Naples and in the outskirts of Naples. We're not in Bethlehem. We are squarely in Naples. So I think this is kind of a funny headline. So the Presepio installation brings together, it's this convergence of the religious and the secular worlds. And so on the left side, what you're seeing is called the Mistero, the mystery. So this is the devotional component. Of course, we have the Holy Family, and they are set not in a stable, they are in a Roman ruin. So in art history, and absolutely in this period, putting Christ at the base of a Roman ruin signifies the passing of the pagan order, the fall of Rome, and the coming of the Christian era. So this is a very strong symbol that's also part of the landscape around Naples. There are still, classical ruins in this time period. So this is both part of lived experience for Neapolitans and also a very potent symbol. And so just to talk about that symbol a little bit, you can see throughout paintings and prints in this period, many places where the nativity is depicted amid ruin. On the right, you're seeing that in a work by Dürer. On the left, this scene takes it a little bit further. So this is actually a pre-Christian scene, but this is Caesar Augustus. And this is depicting the moment when the Roman Senate has just voted to make Augustus a god after his death. And he is seeking the counsel of an oracle, the Tiburtine Sibyl, and saying, should I be worshipped as a god after my death? Is that appropriate? And she, in Roman tradition, is one of 10 women who has powers bestowed upon her by the gods to be an oracle. And she is telling him that her powers are actually fading because a child is coming who's going to rule the world. And as she's telling him this, the clouds open and the Madonna and the Christ child appear to them. But what do we have above them but Roman ruins? And even the weeds sprouting from the base of the columns suggest that idea of rebirth, of something new. So the Presepio picks up on these very important symbols in placing the Holy Family beneath a Roman ruin. So this is also the portion of the Presepio where, of course, we see the angels. And we're fortunate to have, I'm going to count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, there's a little one, 9. We have 9 angels that we routinely display. We have some more that are in rough shape, and if we conserved them, we could have a couple more angels in the choir. And we actually suspend them from wires up here, and it's quite challenging but also fun to try to imitate that kind of artistic cascade every year when we do this installation. This part of the scene also includes the Magi, the kings, which we have here, and here, and I think the third one is just off frame. But we do have Balthazar, the Moorish king of Ethiopia, Melchior, the young king, and Caspar, the old king. It's interesting to note that the kings are riding Arabian horses in the Presepio. This is a detail that sometimes irks visitors because they say, shouldn't they be on camels? And there are camels in some Presepi, but there are also Arabian horses. And so, this is just part of how our understanding of these stories change over time. So we don't have any camels. This is also another wonderful symbol from Scripture that's easily missed when you're looking at the Presepio. This guy sleeping right here, he's beneath the Holy Family, which is right above him, and he represents mankind slumbering in ignorance as Christ came into the world. So some people think he's a drunk and he's passed out, and that's not it at all. He's actually representing part of the more devotional aspect of this object. Now, I'm not sure how he sleeps so well because there is also this band around, presumably playing very loudly, and the band is a mixture of peoples, of individuals. Some have very dark complexions. Some have a lighter tan complexion. These figures represent a Turkish band. They might not have only come from Turkey. Basically, they represent a band from either North Africa or the Near East. If you think again about Naples' position in the Mediterranean, I mentioned what a thriving port, an active port city it was. So ships would come from all over the Mediterranean, and there were often parades, whether it's musicians or other figures that come off the ships to kind of announce their presence in the city. So this is a detail that would have resonated as very true to residents of Naples in the middle of the 1700s. Oh yeah, I see that every, such and such a season when those boats arrive, these guys get out and they parade around our city. So again, they're bringing in their own lived experience and kind of layering that on top of and overlapping with the biblical story. The other part of the Presepio, and this isn't just ours, this is very commonly how the kind of two elements are set up in juxtaposition. On the left, I said we have the Mistero. On the right, we have the busy market scene. And so this is our cheese cellar. And this is one of my favorite parts of the display. If you look in front of him on the table, there are all of these fantastic cheeses. Some of them are hard cheeses with a rind, that have not been cut into yet. Others, like these little baskets here that are white on top, those are soft cheeses like ricotta. So those would have been kind of wrapped in a cotton cloth and then put in a little basket. And there are also there's also loaves of bread, and so you have this wonderful detail in the scenes of everyday life as well. And of course, behind the cheese seller, we have the innkeeper. So we do have an inn. The Holy Family's not in the inn, but we do have an inn in Naples. And so this is the innkeeper, and he's carrying a plate of spaghetti, and there's this little dog that's begging at his feet. One of the real tricks of this installation that I've learned in the time that I work with it, that I've worked with it, is that these are all such lively characters, and we'll see this a little bit more in the subsequent slides. They have a role to play. They're not just standing there looking dull. And you have to figure out, as you're installing this, what role they're supposed to play. Where are their eyes looking? What's their expression? And then imagine, are they shopping? Are they engaged in conversation? Are they arguing? Have they actually stopped, startled, because they've noticed an angel in the sky? And their daily experience has been impacted by the arrival of the Christ child. So here's the dog. So this dog, anybody who's ever had a dog, right? This dog is begging. This dog, he's looking up, he sees something delicious, his back is arched, his little tail's up. So, you have to put him with somebody who has food, because he's looking up and pleading to a person for something. And so these are some of the wonderful challenges and tricks of installing. The other thing you can see in the dog here, he's made of solid terracotta clay, which is then painted. And that's the same way that the faces and necks, the bust of all the figures are made. They're all made out of terracotta clay, and then they're painted. Inset into that clay are glass eyes. And so these are incredibly realistic. So here we're seeing the same girl that I showed you before in the context of the genre scene. But this time I'd encourage you to look at the grapes in her hand and at her feet. So every single grape is a tiny little ball of tinted translucent wax. And then those each have a tiny little thread embedded in the wax, and they're tied into a bundle of grapes. These things are like 1/8 of an inch across, and they're translucent, so they really look like grapes. And this is just the level of detail that the Presepio artists brought to all of the different elements, which is truly incredible. So I mentioned, some people are going about their business unaware of what's going on in the other half of the scene, but other people are looking up. This fellow as well. And in this case, they have both noticed this angel. And so this is something that we've started doing a couple of years ago, which is to bring one of the angels into the right half of the scene, helping to connect the two halves. And so some of the people in the marketplace are unaware, but others notice her, and then presumably are pulled into the other half of the scene to go pay their respects to the Christ child. And again, I talked about how with the dog, you have to figure out where these figures are supposed to be. And when you look at his expression, that's an expression of awe. He has noticed something. So wherever he goes in the scene, he needs to be looking at an angel or up at the temple. He's been stopped in his tracks. There are many shepherds and their flocks. Those figure prominently into the display. This fellow is known as the Piferari shepherd, and historically he arrives in town during Advent and plays a particular tune that is alerting people to the coming of their Savior. So we often position him on the bridge, which is in the middle of the scene, again, to link everyday life with the miraculous occurrence. Another linking element is this little band here. So this fellow is driving into town on a cart pulled by an ox, and he has casks of wine on the back. So they are actually very near the Mistero, near the Holy Family, but seem to have no idea. They've just, come from the countryside, and they're going do over here, and they're going to join in the transaction. So there are these things that pull everything together. So one of the other things that we've started doing in the last decade is pulling out figures one or two at a time and putting them into a case alongside the display. This allows people to get up close. And unfortunately, we can't all climb in the Presepio and look at these figures in detail. So one of my favorite to feature is this angel. We have undressed her, and so you can see the way that these bodies are created. So I mentioned the head and bust is terracotta, so that's the clay piece of it. Her wings are painted wood. They're on little pins, little nails, and they poke into her back. There's 2 holes in the terracotta breastplate that both allow her wings to insert, and also allow this twine or flax rope to be lashed to the bust to keep it in place. So it's like a China doll. It has a wireframe body, and originally you could bend these figures all over the place. We don't do that to them now. If the wireframe body didn't break, goodness knows their costumes would. But originally you could decide one year that a figure was sitting, and the next year that the figure is in mid-stride, walking up a step. And so that's something that's unfortunately lost to us today as a possibility, just given their fragility and their age. And then the hands and feet are also typically wood. So the paint that's on top of the clay face and the same paint on the wooden arms and legs unifies them, but they are made of different materials. And they have different needs and concerns over time. Of course, the clay, if ever struck, can shatter. The wood over the years has been susceptible to insect damage, and because wood also responds to changes in moisture and humidity in the air, the wood can cause the paint to flake off, whereas the paint doesn't readily flake off the faces. So a little bit more about the angels and condition, because I think they're a very telling case. So here you see the angels, again, from those pictures from which they were chosen in the 50s. And I suspect that these photos from the 1950s are already second or third generation costumes for the angels, because you have to hang the angels. The amount of handling you have to do every year to get the angel up in the air, to get her wings in, it's just a lot of wear and tear on the costumes. But these costumes, the ones that we acquired with the angels, were in total tatters by the 1990s. And so I'm a little embarrassed to show you this slide, but this was our initial attempt, again, this is 25 years ago, to reclothe them. We preserved the original costumes down in storage. I'm so grateful to a gentleman, Eric Serrano, a Pittsburgher and proud Italian. And Eric collects Presepio figures himself, and he approached me 13 years ago and said, the workshops are still active in Naples. If we give them the angels' dimensions, we can have much better costumes made. And so Eric gave us funds in 2007 for the 50th anniversary of the Presepio, and these are their new costumes. So much better. And so this is how these are dressed today. And I think the trick here is using the right kind of silk, the right kind of Duppiani silk fabric, which the workshops in Naples are still using. There's also wire carefully worked into the edges of the whole costume, and that allows you to bend and give these the kind of billows that make them look just like the angels in the paintings. So this is another pair that we have displayed separately. These are travelers. These are regional characters and not residents of the city of Naples. And that would have been immediately apparent to period audiences. He is dressed in traveling clothes, and the bags over his shoulder also denote that he's come, as well as his cape, denote that he's come from the countryside. She's even more specific. Her headscarf, which is actually molded in clay into her head. There's an initial headscarf, and then there's an additional piece of fabric that goes over that. But her costume identifies her as a resident of Procida, which was in the 18th century a contested island state just off the coast of Naples of some 16,000 people that had come under Bourbon rule. So I mentioned that Maria Amalia and Carlos's son Ferdinand succeeded his father to the throne, and he was really fascinated with regional costumes. Again, he grew up in Naples, but he was Spanish, and so he was really interested in all of the regional traditions that were in Naples and Sicily. And so he commissioned in the 1770s a book that illustrated all the regional costumes of his subjects. And that book served as the inspiration for a dining service that was produced by Capodimonte, the porcelain factory, but it also served as a source book for designs for Presepio figures. And so the Procidana would have been one of the figures that was featured in that publication. We can also appreciate in her costume some of the conservation challenges that we face. So if you look at this gray area here and this gray area right here, looks very dull, kind of a pewter gray. That's actually sterling silver thread. And so when this was originally made, this would have glistened the same way, your grandchildren's sequined Halloween costume might. This would have been quite sparkly. But of course the silver has tarnished over the years, and there's no way for us to get at the silver on this thread that's deeply entwined with 300-year-old silk to clean it. And so it just has to stay dark gray. But you can see all of the textiles. His outfit, he's wearing wool and linen. She's wearing mainly silk, but also linen. And all of these textiles fade in the light. And they just become embrittled. So a number of figures have problems with the pleated skirts. They start to fray along the pleats. I did a little calculation the other day. If we have this on view every year for 8 weeks, more or less, in the time that it's been on the museum, it's like cumulatively having it on view for 10 years. And it's not covered, right? So dust falls on it. So you just imagine if you set something out for 10 years, just left it there untouched, just how much it would gather dust and dirt. And so these are just challenges for us going forward of preservation. How do we balance the overwhelming desire to show this annually for our visitors with preserving this work of art for another 60 years and well beyond that? We have also featured in that little vitrine on the side some of the terracotta figures. So I mentioned you also saw the fisherman, the one who was pointing his hand towards the sky. The fisherman, these two, and one other beggar are called academic figures. These are some of the earliest figures in the Presepio, and unlike that angel that I showed you, these are sculpted entirely in terracotta. You may also remember I said this one was made by the court sculptor Giuseppe San Martino. And almost all trained sculptors in this period who were working in marble or other materials would have made bozzetti, little models in terracotta first. So this was very much part of the sculptor's practice to make little terracotta works. And so these these are more akin to fine art sculptures or studies. And so they're quite valued by collectors, and they are more rare because as time went on, there was a preference for the figures that could move and be repositioned. So we're quite fortunate to have 3 of these early academic figures. So putting these various figures to the side and letting people look at them up close is just one of the ways that we've tried to adapt our presentations for modern audiences to balance a traditional display while also providing opportunities for learning. And we want to continue to do more of that. As I've started to allude to, the Presepio presents endless challenges and questions going forward. How do we reconcile that desire for annual display with increasingly fragile figures? Should we reclothe anybody else like we reclothed the angels? Is that an appropriate method to continue to do when a costume is just too fragile, to preserve the original and basically come up with a display version? I also mentioned that idea of a composer, right? So our Presepio was composed with the assistance of the guidance of Eugenio Catello in the 1950s. But there has been more research done since then. How much could we change our composition to bring it more in line with what we understand 18th century Presepio would have looked like? And how do we balance that with the expectations of our visitors who love it just the way it is, as composed in Pittsburgh in the late 50s? Let's see. Should we ever add any additional figures? Things do come to market. I mentioned camels. There are elephants. There are Eastern Europeans, an entourage from Georgia of these ladies with greyhounds. Should we consider that, or should we honor the legacy of the Catello collection as selected and keep it as it was? I'm also very interested in how we could improve both storage and display to cut down on the annual handling of the figures. So every year we set up the whole set, and every year we take 100 people and another 36 animals, and we place them where they go. So that means touching them and moving them year after year. How could we better integrate the display and the storage so that maybe we don't have to touch the individual figures at all? We just roll pieces into place and lock them together. And then, finally, I would love to see us publish this work, both to cement its place in scholarship. I mentioned this is the first Presepio that was on public display in this country, and it's also an incredibly large and intact collection, and we should be proud of that. And people also often ask for souvenirs when they come to visit, and so it would be great to have something that, a publication about this work that people could buy in our museum shop. So I think these are just a few of our questions as we think about its next 60 years. And I hope you will all come out and visit and take a docent tour. But we have a few minutes. It's 11 on the dot, so I'm happy to take questions. We have some. Yes, here.
The question you're saying about the preserving it, we tried to think about having a three-dimensionally, you take out each one of those statues and then have a three-dimensional model made of them. And that way they're dressed and everything. All you have to do is just pay them, and then you have them, and you don't have to preserve the clothes or anything. They'd be all there intact.
And replicas, whether digitally created or created, kind of purely by hand. Yes, we have considered those things. There's always challenges, though, because we're also a museum of art, and we want to provide the experience with the original. That's why people come to museums, is to have that experience. So yeah, somewhere on that spectrum, eventually we will face those kinds of decisions.
I'm saying those are only going to last maybe another 60 years. That. And this way you'll be ahead of the game, so when they fade away, pop them in.
Yeah, and I will say that digitally scanning and reproducing maybe slightly less complicated forms is a route that we've gone with other objects. We for a project I did a couple years ago, we totally 3D scanned and then digitally CNC'd, carved a couch. We reproduced a couch because the original was completely degrading. So we have done that. Yes.
2 questions. Generally, how tall are the figurines? And secondly, is there a value that has been placed on the entire collection?
So the first question, the size of the figurines. And I talked about how important the appearance of accurate perspective is. So the figures actually range in size from 18 inches in the front to about 8 inches in the back. We could, also to that idea of, what other figures might it be nice to have, ideally we'd have a more full range of different sizes, so you could have a nice gradient. What we actually have is a whole lot of figures that are 12, 13 inches tall, and we don't have as many that can go in the background. To the value question, yes, there is a number and it is valuable. I'm not at liberty to talk prices, but it's important, and we do keep up with having it appraised so that we understand its monetary value as well as its artistic value. Yes, way in the back.
Where's this located, the address?
The address? 4400 Forbes Avenue in Oakland.
You mentioned this was the first Presepio in this country. Are there other displays in this country, and how does ours compare with them?
Yes, so there are other displays in this country, both public and private. In terms of the public collections, the other best known collection is probably the Metropolitan Museum of Art's quote unquote angel tree. And the Met's collection came from a woman named Loretta Hines Howard. So Loretta Hines Howard is the Met's Mr. and Mrs. Wyckoff. And she purchased pieces from the Catello collection a decade after the Carnegie did. So the pieces, if you're ever at the Met during the holiday season, see their angel tree and know that their pieces and our pieces came from the same family's collection in Italy. There are smaller collections, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the Milwaukee Art Museum, the White House has a very tiny one. I don't know how often they display it. But more recently, the Art Institute of Chicago actually just acquired one. So they had not had one previously, and they acquired one for their museum about 3-4 years ago. Yes?
What did Chicago pay for their museum, their artwork?
I honestly do not know. If you're really curious about prices, auction records are online. If you do a little searching, you may be able to find some individual auction results for yourself if you're curious. Yeah?
When will your display go on? When can people see it?
So we will publicize that this goes on view the week after Thanksgiving with our trees. The secret is that actually we install this every year the 3 days before Thanksgiving. So if you go the Thanksgiving weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you can see it. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the next week, we're setting up trees. And so you can't see it. And then starting Thursday that week, it's on view. That's hard to explain, so we just tell people that later date. But in fact, if you come Thanksgiving weekend, it's a very happy surprise, and that's when a lot of people know to come and see it.
The terracotta heads and the body is wood. How would they be attached? I did figurine work at the St. John Cathedral in New York City. They had statues from the 1890s. But they were mostly plaster, all wire connected.
Yeah.
I was wondering how they did the clay to the wood.
So the bodies are actually flax. They're thread or rope. So yeah, here, sorry. So right, Right, so this part is terracotta, and then there is a wireframe skeleton in there, which is wired in and tied to the terracotta. So the back of the terracotta has a couple holes in it that you can thread through and tie tightly to, and then that whole wireframe is wrapped and wrapped and wrapped and wrapped with twine until it gets the kind of proportion of a body.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about how much it costs to break reality?
Yeah, we do have. There are two different needs for this work of art. One is really the long-term need for preserving and representing this that I've talked about. The other, of course, are the annual presentation costs. So our annual budget for the Presepio and the holiday trees in the Hall of Architecture is about $25,000. That includes security, that includes our setup costs and some materials. But both the long-term needs and the annual presentation needs are areas where we very much appreciate support. Yeah?
Are people doing this today? Are people making these kinds of scenes today?
Yes, that is an excellent question. Are people making these kinds of scenes today? Oh my goodness, yes. The tradition is very, very much alive in Naples. In fact, there's a particular market street where you can go and buy historical figures as well as modern figures. You can buy world leaders, you can buy Steve Jobs, you can buy athletes, you can buy, I don't have it in this version of the presentation, but there's this fantastic image during Berlusconi's last term, and the Berlusconis are like 50% off on markdown. So yeah, the tradition is very much alive, both in a traditional manner, but this continuation of a display that brings together both aspect of religious devotion and everyday life.
Rachel?
Yeah.
That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And you did most of it without any notes. What got you interested in this subject?
What got me interested in the subject? Well, this particular subject came with the job, but I fell in love with it. So I'm a decorative arts scholar by training. So I work with furniture and metalwork and ceramics and textiles and glass, throughout the museum's collection. And I had deep experience and training in that when I came to the museum, but I knew nothing when I walked in the door in 2005, and this was handed to me, and I've just become so invested and really fascinated with it over the years. All right, good.